Usually when we talk about medical diagnosis, there's this inherent expectation of precision. It feels almost like engineering.
Right. It's very binary.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, well, there it is. There's the problem.
And it's either broken or it's not broken. It's simple.
And it's comforting. I mean, we fundamentally like things to be visible. We like them to be categorized and neatly put into a box.
Yeah, absolutely. We crave that certainty.
But then you step into the world of human behavior. You start looking at the daily routines that, actually dictate the trajectory of our lives. And suddenly that pristine x-ray machine is totally useless.
It really is.
We're looking at a behavioral landscape that is, well, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
It's murky because so much of it is completely invisible to our conscious minds.
Yeah.
Which is, frankly, a terrifying thought for a lot of people.
And that is exactly why we are here. So, welcome to this special Extended Cortex Lab deep dive.
I'm very excited for this one.
Today, our mission is to explore the architecture of habit formation. We're taking a highly customized journey into the invisible forces that dictate a staggering 40% of our daily actions.
Yeah, that statistic is always the one that stops people in their tracks. 40%.
Wait, really? Almost half.
Almost half. I mean, 40% of everything you do today, what you eat, how you speak to your kids, how you perform at your job, is not an active conscious choice. It is a habit running in the background.
That is just wild.
Yeah.
And to you, the listener, whether you're trying to break a bad habit that's been dragging you down, or, maybe you're trying to build a new one to elevate your life.
Or even if you're just trying to understand why your company operates in the bizarre, dysfunctional way that it does.
Right, exactly. This deep dive is designed to be a shortcut to those aha moments.
Yeah.
We want to give you the tools to map that murky behavioral landscape.
Because the material we're synthesizing today is fundamentally grounded in decades of neurological and sociological research.
Yeah, we're looking at the hard neurology of our routines, we're dissecting massive societal and corporate case studies, and we're going to build an actionable blueprint for your own life.
Plus, we'll make sure to address the common pitfalls and the specific questions you all sent in for the FAQ section.
Okay, let's unpack this because the central premise here is, frankly, mind-blowing to me. The idea that everything I think of as a conscious decision, from like the way I lace my shoes in the morning, to the exact route I drive to work, to that specific moment I grab a snack in the afternoon.
You're saying, what if that's actually a pre-programmed neurological loop?
Yeah. I mean, where does that even start?
Well, to understand where it starts, we have to look at the brain's core operating principle. Basically, the brain is inherently lazy.
Lazy, really.
But I mean that in the most highly efficient evolutionary sense. Your brain consumes a massive amount of energy, so it's constantly looking for ways to save effort.
Okay, that makes sense. Like power saving mode on a laptop?
Exactly. It wants to minimize cognitive load so it has reserve power for actual emergencies. And to do this, it utilizes a neurological process called chunking.
Chunking. Like, breaking a long phone number into 3 smaller pieces so you can remember it.
Conceptually similar, yeah, but physically much more profound. This happens deep inside the brain, in an ancient golf ball-sized structure called the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia. Okay.
Right, so to give you a picture, your prefrontal cortex, the wrinkly outer layer right behind your forehead, that is where your conscious thinking happens. That's your active RAM.
Got it. So that's the part that's working right now while we're talking.
Precisely. So when you learn a new sequence of actions, let's say backing your car out of a tight driveway for the first time, your prefrontal cortex is working in absolute overdrive.
Oh, I remember learning to drive. You're sweating, you're checking the rear view mirror, the side mirror, you're feeling the resistance on the brake pedal.
You're judging the distance to the mailbox.
Yeah, it takes all of your focus. You have to tune the radio down just to see better.
Exactly, because millions of neurons are firing to process all that novel information. But once you back out of that exact same driveway 100 times, the basal ganglia takes over.
So it just kind of absorbs the task.
It observes that sequence of behaviors, mirror, brake, turn, gas, and it chunks that entire sequence into a single automatic routine.
Wow.
And once that routine is chunked and stored in the basal ganglia, the rest of your brain, including the prefrontal cortex, can literally power down while you do it.
Which is why you can back out of your driveway while simultaneously thinking about what you want for dinner.
Because the basal ganglia is driving the car, not your conscious mind.
That brings up a story from the material that I found absolutely captivating. It perfectly illustrates how separate this basal ganglia system is from our conscious memory.
You're talking about the Eugene Pauly case.
Yes. referred to as EP in the literature.
And he suffered from severe amnesia, right?
He did. EP contracted a rare case of viral encephalitis,
Huh.
and the virus essentially chewed through his medial temporal lobe, completely destroying his hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for forming new conscious memories.
Right. So his conscious RAM was totally wiped out.
The story notes that he couldn't remember his own living room. I mean, if you asked him to draw a map of the street he lived on, he couldn't do it.
He couldn't tell you what he had for breakfast 5 minutes after he ate it. If you asked him to point out where the kitchen was in his own house, a house he had lived in for years, he would just look at you blankly.
He literally did not know.
He had no idea.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, if he was sitting in the living room and his stomach rumbled because he was hungry, he wouldn't say, "I'm going to the kitchen."
No, he would simply stand up, walk down the hall, turn the correct corner into the kitchen, open a specific cabinet, and grab a jar of nuts.
That is incredible. He could also walk out his front door, take a mile-long stroll around his neighborhood, and navigate back home perfectly.
But if you stopped him on that walk and asked him where he lived, he couldn't tell you the address.
This phenomenon completely baffled neurologists, right? Until Larry Squire began studying Eugene.
Yes, Squire is a brilliant professor of psychiatry and neuroscience. His research fundamentally changed our understanding of the brain because he proved that habits operate entirely outside of conscious memory.
Because the basal ganglia was completely untouched by the virus that destroyed Eugene's hippocampus.
Exactly.
Wait, so how did Squire actually prove that the basal ganglia was doing this and not just some, I don't know, residual trace memory?
Well, Squire set up an ingenious, highly repetitive experiment. He took 16 different random objects, plastic toys, cardboard cutouts, things like that, and put them in front of Eugene.
Okay.
The objects were glued to cardboard bases, and underneath one object in each pair, there was a sticker that said correct. Squire asked Eugene to choose the correct object.
And Eugene had no idea what was going on.
None. EP was totally confused. He would say things like, "Gosh sakes, how am I supposed to remember this?"
Because he couldn't form new memories.
Right. He would try to turn the objects over to look for a mark. When the researchers stopped him from peeking, he would just guess, and he'd say, "I think that's just a habit." Outside the context of his daily routine, the objects made absolutely no sense to him.
But they kept doing this test, day after day.
36 days of training. Every single day, Eugene would sit down, look at the objects, and have zero memory of ever seeing them before or ever meeting the researcher before.
Man, that sounds exhausting.
But by day 36, Eugene was choosing the correct objects 95% of the time.
That is wild. He couldn't remember the test, but his brain knew the answer.
Precisely. His basal ganglia had chunked the correct choices into a habit loop. Squire proved that you do not need to remember a routine to learn a routine.
The basal ganglia stores these patterns so the brain can survive the overwhelming minutiae of daily life, even when the conscious mind is entirely blank.
Yes, that's exactly the takeaway.
Okay, so if the basal ganglia is this powerful tape recorder, just saving all these routines, how does it know when to press play? Because I don't just randomly start backing my car up while I'm sitting at my desk.
Right, there has to be a mechanism, and there is. It's the foundational framework of all behavioral science. It is called the habit loop,
The habit loop.
and it consists of 3 highly specific parts: the cue, the routine, and the reward.
Break those down for us. What exactly constitutes a cue?
The cue is the trigger. It is a piece of information from your environment that tells your basal ganglia, okay, power down the prefrontal cortex, switch into automatic mode, and run this specific tape.
So a cue could be anything.
Almost anything. A time of day, a visual trigger, an emotional state, or even just the company of a certain person.
So seeing the steering wheel of my car is the cue.
Yes. And then follows the routine, which is the behavior itself. It's the chunk sequence of actions.
Like lacing your shoes.
That's a physical routine. But it can be mental, too, like automatically thinking about your ex when a certain song plays. Or emotional, like instantly feeling anxious when your boss emails you.
Oh, I know that feeling. And the reward is the payoff at the end.
Correct. The reward is crucial because it helps your brain figure out if this particular loop is actually worth remembering for the future.
So if the reward is sweet or relieving or satisfying, the brain says, save this pathway.
Yes. It reinforces the loop.
But just having a trigger, an action, and a payoff, I mean, that doesn't fully explain why some habits feel utterly impossible to break. Like if I hear my phone buzz, that's the cue, I pick it up and scroll, that's the routine.
And the momentary distraction is the reward.
Right. But
Yeah.
why do I feel this magnetic pull to pick it up? Just having those three parts isn't enough to make it automatic. There has to be an engine driving it.
You've hit on the exact mechanism that turns a simple loop into an inescapable compulsion. To explain the engine of habit, we have to look at the groundbreaking research of a neuroscientist named Wolfram Schultz.
Okay, I love a good science deep dive. What did Schultz do?
He spent years studying the brainwaves of a monkey named Julio.
All right, an animal study. Walk us through Julio's day in the lab.
So Schultz put Julio in a dimly lit room, seated in a chair facing a computer monitor. On the monitor, Schultz would flash different colored shapes, a yellow spiral, a red squiggle, blue lines.
And this was designed to be the cue.
Exactly. When Julio saw these shapes, he had been taught to reach out and pull a lever, which was the routine.
And what was his payoff?
Whenever he pulled the lever after seeing the shapes, a tube positioned near his mouth would deliver a single drop of delicious, sweet blackberry juice. That was the reward.
So far, this sounds like a very standard high school psychology Pavlovian setup. Bell rings, dog salivates, shape flashes, monkey pulls lever, gets juice.
Initially, yes, it was entirely standard, but Schultz was doing something unprecedented. He had microscopic probes monitoring the electrical activity deep inside the reward centers of Julio's brain. Specifically, he was watching dopamine spikes. Now, at first, when Julio was just learning the loop, his brain activity would spike with a massive pleasure response after the juice hit his tongue.
Which makes sense. The reward caused the dopamine. You eat the cake, you feel happy.
But as the experiment continued, as Julio practiced this loop dozens, then hundreds of times, the habit became ingrained. And when Schultz looked at the brain monitors, something profound had shifted.
What happened?
The dopamine spike in Julio's brain was no longer happening when he got the juice. The pleasure spike was happening the exact millisecond the colored shapes appeared on the screen before the juice even arrived.
Wait. The brain was releasing the reward chemicals before the physical reward even existed.
Precisely. Julio's brain learned to expect the reward just from seeing the cue.
The brain was anticipating the juice.
Yes. But here's the dark side of that anticipation. Once Julio's brain started expecting the juice, Schultz altered the experiment. He would flash the shapes, Julio would pull the lever, but Schultz would dilute the juice. Or he would delay it by 5 seconds. Or he wouldn't deliver it at all.
Oh, poor Julio. How did he react?
He was furious. When the anticipated reward didn't arrive, the neurological joy instantly morphed into a sharp, painful plunge in dopamine.
So the lack of reward actually caused a chemical drop.
A huge drop. Julio would get visibly angry, moping, banging on the equipment, or acting severely depressed. The anticipation had fundamentally transformed into a neurological craving.
And that craving is the engine.
Exactly. When the reward doesn't arrive, that craving drives intense frustration, compelling the brain to seek the routine even harder.
Wow.
Once a monkey or a human develops this neurological craving, they will stick to the routine regardless of distractions. It is no longer a choice. It is a biochemical imperative to satisfy the craving created by the cue.
You know, I always try to visualize this stuff. I think of habit formation like a water channel being carved into a dirt hill.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like the very first time it rains, the water just finds random, jagged paths down the side of the hill. It takes a lot of time and effort to reach the bottom.
Right, there's no set path yet.
But over time, with enough rain, the water carves a specific deep trench into the dirt, a channel. Once that path is deeply carved, any new water that hits the top of the hill doesn't have to think about where to go. It automatically flows exactly into that channel.
It just follows the path of least resistance.
Exactly. The cue is the rain hitting the hill, the channel is the chunk routine, and reaching the bottom pool is the reward.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And the craving in that case is the gravity pulling the water down. You can't just tell gravity to stop working.
But wait, let me push back on this for a second.
Yeah.
Let's follow that logic to its natural conclusion. If our brains are just running these automatic loops, carving these deep trenches, and creating biochemical cravings that spike dopamine before we even realize what's happening,
I think I know where you're going with this.
aren't we just passengers in our own bodies? I mean, if 40% of my day is governed by basal ganglia gravity, am I just essentially a fleshy robot reacting to cues?
That is exactly the existential fear that almost everyone experiences when they first encounter this neuroscience.
Yeah.
It feels deeply deterministic. It feels like a loss of free will.
It really does.
And crucially, this exact fear, this misunderstanding of how inescapable these neurological loops are, is what leads to, and the neurology proves that is impossible. Old habits never truly disappear. They are permanently encoded into the physical structures of your basal ganglia.
They just stay there.
They lurk there, dormant, waiting for the right cue and the right level of craving to reawaken them. Going back to your analogy, you cannot simply delete a water channel that has been carved into a dirt hill. The trench is there. If it rains, the water will flow.
So if I have a deeply ingrained habit and I absolutely cannot delete the trench, what am I supposed to do? Am I just doomed?
Not at all. You apply what the scientific literature calls the golden rule of habit change.
Okay, what's the golden rule?
You cannot delete the loop, but you can overwrite it.
Hmm.
To do this, you must keep the old cue and you must deliver the old reward, but you must insert a new routine into the middle of the loop.
Just swap the middle part.
Yes. Almost any behavior, no matter how deeply entrenched, can be transformed if the trigger and the payoff remain exactly the same.
Okay, that makes theoretical sense, but let's ground this in reality. I want to look at the case study of Tony Dungy and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers from the notes, because this perfectly illustrates the golden rule on a highly physical, high-stakes level.
It's one of the most elegant applications of habit theory in sports history. When Tony Dungy took over as head coach of the Buccaneers in the late 1990s, the team was, by all statistical and cultural accounts, terrible. They were the perennial laughingstock of the NFL.
Right. And usually when a new head coach comes in, they bring this massive phone book-sized playbook. They want to reinvent the wheel, confuse the opposing offense with complex schemes, and make the players memorize entirely new strategies.
But when Dungy pitched his strategy to the team owners, he explicitly told them he was going to do the exact opposite. He wasn't going to teach his players new habits.
Because he understood neurology.
He knew that these professional athletes had spent their entire lives, from Pop Warner to college, building the physical habits that got them to the NFL. You can't just delete those neural pathways and expect them to perform under the extreme stress of a football game.
So Dungy applied the golden rule. He didn't change the cues. For a football player, the cues are the physical tells of the opposing team, like the angle of a lineman's foot, the subtle shift of a running back's shoulders, the spacing of the wide receivers.
Those cues are permanent. They're built into the game.
Right. And Dungy didn't change the reward either, which was winning the game, getting the tackle, the roar of the crowd, the massive paycheck. He kept the cue and the reward identical.
But he completely shifted their routines. In a standard NFL defense, a player sees a cue, and then their prefrontal cortex has to analyze it. Okay, the running back shifted left, so I need to step back, read the quarterback's eyes, communicate with the linebacker, and choose one of 6 defensive coverages.
And that thinking process takes maybe half a second.
Which in the NFL is a lifetime. If you're thinking, you're losing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what did Dungy do?
Dungy's philosophy was to remove the decision-making process entirely. He trained them to look at only 1 or 2 extremely specific visual cues, not the whole field, just the guy directly in front of them. And then he drilled a very specific, simplified physical routine in response. Step left, plant the foot, drive forward.
So he was carving a new, steeper water channel right next to the old one?
Yes. He used their existing triggers and payoffs to install a faster, more efficient routine. He drilled it endlessly in practice until the basal ganglia took over.
And what was the result?
When the cue happened during a game, the new routine fired automatically without the players even having to think. Their reaction times dropped by milliseconds, which made them the fastest defense in the league. And eventually, he won a Super Bowl using this exact philosophy of habit replacement.
That is brilliant because it conserves mental energy. The prefrontal cortex gets to rest, which leads directly into pitfall number 2, piling on too much change at once.
This is a huge one.
Because if Dungy had tried to change the cue, the routine, and the reward all at once, the players' brains would have overloaded. And we all do this in our personal lives. You know, New Year's Day hits, and you decide, okay, I'm going to run 5 miles a day. I'm going to eat only raw kale. I'm going to learn conversational French, and I'm waking up at 5 a.m.
And by January 4th, you are eating a jelly donut in bed at 8 a.m. while watching TV.
Exactly. We laugh, but it happens universally. Why is that?
Because of a fundamental misunderstanding of our own biology. Willpower is not just a skill or a mood. It is a finite biological resource. It operates exactly like a fatigable muscle.
So it actually gets tired.
When you try a radical life overhaul, you are draining that willpower muscle on multiple fronts simultaneously. Your prefrontal cortex is working so hard to suppress the old habit loops that it literally exhausts its energy supply.
So the basal ganglia is just sitting there waiting for the prefrontal cortex to get tired.
Precisely. The old habit loops just wait in the background. As soon as you get stressed at work or you don't sleep well, your willpower muscle gives out, and the old, heavily carved water channels reassert themselves.
The sources are abundantly clear on this, right?
Mm.
Radical, multi-front life overhauls almost always fail because they require an unsustainable amount of simultaneous willpower. Small, targeted habit replacement is the only sustainable method.
Yes. You have to focus on one thing at a time.
Which brings us to pitfall number 3, and this one is a bit more abstract, but honestly, it seems like the most crucial piece of the puzzle. Ignoring the belief factor.
Yes. This is where the sheer mechanics of the habit loop hit a psychological wall. Even if you apply the golden rule perfectly, even if you map out your cues, carefully swap the routine, and maintain the exact same reward, rewritten habits will frequently fail and revert during times of high stress unless the person truly believes that permanent change is possible.
To illustrate this, the notes bring up Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. And what I find wild about AA is that from a strictly medical standpoint, it shouldn't work. I mean, they don't treat the biochemical root of addiction. They don't use medical interventions to stop the severe physical dependency or the chemical withdrawals.
No, they don't. Instead, AA operates as a giant, intuitive machine for replacing habit loops. It forces alcoholics to meticulously identify their cues. They sit in meetings and map out the triggers, the stress from a spouse, the anger at a boss, the specific time of day when the loneliness hits.
So they isolate the cue, and the old routine was taking a drink. The old reward was numbness or relief from that anxiety.
Correct. AA steps in and provides a new routine. When the cue of stress hits, the new routine is to go to a meeting or call a sponsor or pray or simply talk through the anxiety with the group.
And the reward.
The ultimate reward, the cathartic relief from stress, the feeling of safety and release, remains very similar to the emotional payoff they sought from alcohol.
So they apply the golden rule perfectly. Keep the cue, change the routine, keep the reward. But that still doesn't explain the belief part. Because you could do all of that alone in your room and still relapse.
And many do. The secret sauce, the element that makes the new habit stick under the crushing weight of a life crisis, is belief. For a habit change to remain permanent, individuals must believe that they can cope with stress without the old habit. And psychological research shows that this kind of profound belief is most effectively fostered within a community.
So it's the social proof.
Exactly. AA uses the group dynamic to instill belief. When you are sitting in a circle and you see someone else, someone who is just as broken as you, who faced the exact same cues and cravings, successfully utilizing the new routine, it helps you suspend your own disbelief. The group provides the structural integrity for the new habit to calcify.
So when people try to quit a deeply ingrained bad habit cold turkey completely alone, they're essentially fighting a multi-front war against their own brain architecture.
They really are.
They're trying to delete a basal ganglia loop that physically cannot be deleted, using a prefrontal willpower muscle that will eventually fatigue entirely without the structural support of community belief.
That is a perfect synthesis of why most habit changes fail. It is a biological battle you are not equipped to win through brute force.
Okay, this is a massive paradigm shift. But if the golden rule, targeted willpower management, and belief communities work for a single individual brain, what happens when you take these exact same neurological principles and apply them to a massive corporation?
That's where things get really fascinating.
Right. Because if you can change a person, can you change 100,000 people? If a company operates like a giant collective basal ganglia, then changing its habits could completely alter its trajectory.
This is where the science scales up from the microscopic neurons to the macroscopic boardroom. And the core concept we need to understand at this scale is the keystone habit.
The keystone habit.
In any complex system, a human life or a global corporation, not all habits are created equal. Some habits matter vastly more than others because they possess the unique power to start a chain reaction.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. When you change a keystone habit, it dislodges and remakes other patterns throughout the entire organization.
The prime example of this in the material is the story of Paul O'Neill taking over as CEO of Alcoa, the aluminum company of America. And to really understand the impact of a keystone habit, we have to set the scene.
It's quite a scene.
It is 1987. It's a blustery October day in a Manhattan hotel ballroom. Wall Street investors, analysts, the financial elite are all gathered. Alcoa has been struggling for years. They are making massive missteps, facing new international competition, and losing profits rapidly.
The tension was high.
The investors in that ballroom are anxious. They're waiting for this new, relatively unknown CEO to come out and give the standard corporate speech. They want to hear about synergy, profit margins, aggressive cost-cutting, union busting, the usual Wall Street music.
And Paul O'Neill walks out onto the stage. He doesn't look like a typical CEO. He has a bit of a maverick reputation. He walks to the podium, ignores the financial spreadsheets entirely, looks at the crowd and says, "I want to talk to you about worker safety. I intend to make Alcoa the safest company in America. I intend to go for 0 injuries."
I can just imagine the air leaving the room. The investors completely panicked.
Oh, they did.
There's a story about one prominent investor who literally ran out of the ballroom, found a payphone in the lobby, called his top clients, and yelled at them to sell every share of Alcoa stock immediately. He said the board of directors had put a crazy hippie in charge who was going to destroy the company by focusing on safety instead of profits.
And as the research points out, telling his clients to sell was the worst financial advice that guy ever gave in his entire career.
It was a disastrously bad call. Because over the next decade, under O'Neill's leadership, Alcoa's market capitalization ended up rising by $27 billion. They became one of the most profitable and efficient companies on Earth. And it was entirely due to that hippie focus on worker safety.
It's an incredible turnaround.
So how did worker safety lead to a $27 billion profit?
Yeah.
Walk me through the mechanics of that keystone habit.
Well, O'Neill fundamentally understood organizational routines. He knew that if you walked in and just ordered a massive, sprawling manufacturing company to be more efficient or cut costs, nothing would happen.
Right, because you can't just mandate culture change.
You can't order an organization to change its culture any more than you can order your basal ganglia to stop craving sugar. The entrenched factions, the unions, the managers, they would all resist. Instead, he targeted one keystone habit that everyone, from the factory floor to the boardroom, could agree on. Nobody wants to see a worker get hurt.
That's a universal truth.
He used that as the wedge to force everything else to align.
He created the Alcoa institutional loop. He defined the cue, the routine, and the reward for the entire company.
Right.
The cue was an employee getting injured on the job. A splash of molten metal, a broken arm from a machine. The routine, and this was non-negotiable, was that the unit president had to report the injury directly to O'Neill within 24 hours. But they couldn't just report it. They had to present a detailed, systemic plan for making sure that specific injury never happened again. And the reward: promotion. O'Neill made it explicitly clear that only the managers who embraced this safety system would get promoted.
That loop sounds simple, but think about the systemic shockwave it caused. To fulfill that strict 24-hour reporting requirement, the entire communication infrastructure of the corporation had to be dismantled and rebuilt.
Because 24 hours is a really tight turnaround for a global company in the 80s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A unit president needed to hear from the floor manager immediately. The floor manager needed to hear from the workers immediately. It broke down decades of rigid, slow corporate hierarchies. It forced Alcoa to become one of the very first companies to implement a global corporate email network in the 1980s, just to meet O'Neill's 24-hour deadline.
That's the chain reaction. A safety rule forced an upgrade in global communications.
And it went deeper. To present a plan to prevent future injuries, the managers had to actually understand why the machines were breaking down or why the molten metal was splashing. They couldn't just blame the worker, so they had to study the manufacturing process deeply.
Which means they were finding all the inefficiencies.
Yes. They ended up replacing faulty, inefficient equipment. They redesigned the factory floors. They empowered the lowest-level workers to stop the production line if they saw a hazard.
Which triggered a cascade of small wins. By making the factory safer, they accidentally made it infinitely more efficient. Less broken machinery meant less downtime. Empowered workers meant better quality control. The keystone habit completely shifted the culture. And there was a defining moment early on that proved this culture shift wasn't just corporate lip service. It was the firing of Bob Barton.
Yes. Bob Barton was one of Alcoa's top executives. He was running a massive joint venture down in Mexico, and he was highly profitable. He was a superstar on paper. But one day, there was a fume buildup in his plant. Several dozen workers got sick. It wasn't fatal. People recovered quickly, and Barton fixed the ventilation issue. But Barton never reported the incident to headquarters because he didn't want to tarnish his perfect record, and he figured the problem was already solved.
But O'Neill found out.
Eventually, yes. And when O'Neill found out that an executive had hidden a safety incident, Barton was fired immediately. There was no hesitation, no debate about his profit margins. He was gone.
Because the Keystone habit had created a culture where the values were absolutely painfully clear.
Precisely. As O'Neill explained it, not reporting the injury meant denying the rest of the company the opportunity to learn from the mistake. It was a cardinal sin against the new organizational habit. Firing Barton sent a shockwave through Alcoa. It proved that the Keystone habit had reshaped the very identity of the corporation. Profits were no longer the primary driver. The routine of continuous improvement through safety was.
So O'Neill used a Keystone habit to rebuild an industrial manufacturing giant. The machines and the metal were the variables. But what about a company dealing in a totally different landscape? What about a company dealing almost entirely in customer service, where the variables are unpredictable human emotions? Let's talk about Starbucks, because their approach to organizational habits centers on something we touched on earlier: willpower.
We established earlier that willpower is a fatigable muscle. But we need to emphasize how vital that muscle is. There's a famous sociological study involving 4-year-olds and marshmallows.
Oh, I've heard of this one.
Researchers put a marshmallow in front of a child and told them they could eat it now, or if they waited 15 minutes, they could have 2 marshmallows. They were testing the child's ability to delay gratification.
The ultimate test of willpower for a 4-year-old.
And when the researchers tracked those children down decades later, they found that the kids who had successfully exercised the willpower to wait for the second marshmallow were dramatically more successful in almost every metric of adult life. They had lower rates of addiction, higher incomes, and remarkably, their ability to delay gratification correlated with a 210-point average increase in their SAT scores. Willpower, it turns out, is the single most important keystone habit for individual success.
But, as we discussed, it gets tired. I always conceptualize willpower like the battery on your smartphone. You wake up in the morning assuming you slept well and your battery is at 100%. But every time you exert self-control, you drain the battery. You drain 5% resisting the donuts in the break room. You drain 10% forcing yourself to do tedious spreadsheet data entry instead of scrolling social media. You drain 20% holding your tongue when your boss makes a passive-aggressive comment in a meeting. By the time 4:00 p.m. rolls around, your willpower battery is blinking red at 2%. And when you actually need that willpower to deal with a screaming customer or a crisis, your phone just dies. You snap. You lose your temper.
And Starbucks, as a rapidly expanding corporate entity, realized this was their biggest vulnerability. They were hiring tens of thousands of employees, many of whom were young, working their first jobs, or perhaps coming from highly stressful backgrounds. The sources highlight the case study of Travis Leach, a Starbucks manager who came from a childhood of extreme poverty and familial addiction. For someone like Travis, who was constantly stressed, the willpower battery was almost always running low.
So what happens when a barista with a drained willpower battery encounters a problem?
Starbucks noticed their employees were failing at very specific, predictable moments. The company called these moments inflection points.
An inflection point being an angry customer yelling that their extra hot half-calf mocha frappuccino is too cold.
Exactly. Or a massive line forming during the morning rush, or the espresso machine breaking down. When the inflection point hit, the employee's willpower muscle was simply too tired to remain calm, smile, and diffuse the situation. They would break down, cry, or yell back at the customer. Starbucks realized they couldn't just ask their employees to try harder. You can't ask a dead battery to turn on the screen. So, Starbucks made a brilliant corporate decision. They decided to automate willpower.
Automate willpower. How do you do that?
By pre-programming a habit routine for those specific high-stress inflection points. They took the decision-making process out of the equation. They developed dozens of specific routines, but the most famous is the LATE method.
LATTE. Let's break down the acronym.
L stands for listen to the customer. A is acknowledge their complaint. T is take action by solving the problem immediately. The second T is thank them for bringing it to your attention. And E is explain why the problem occurred in the first place.
It's a script.
It's a chunked neurological routine. By role-playing and drilling this routine endlessly in their training centers, Starbucks made the latte method a basal ganglia habit. When the QA, the angry customer yelling about the frappuccino, appeared, the employee didn't have to use their depleted prefrontal willpower to decide how to react. They didn't have to suppress their anger. The latte routine just kicked in automatically. The reward was a diffused situation, a calm environment, and a happy customer. Starbucks turned the exhausting exertion of willpower into a pre-programmed energy-saving loop.
Okay, that is incredibly smart management. But wait, let's think about the flip side of this. If massive companies like Alcoa and Starbucks know how to map, manipulate, and completely rewrite their own internal organizational habits, then they definitely know how to map and rewrite ours. If I know the combination to the safe, I can put money in, but I can also take it out. Which brings us into the darker territory of consumer behavior. Let's talk about marketing, data tracking, and the ethics of manufactured cravings.
The origins of leveraging consumer habits are much older than most people realize. To see how corporations manufacture a habit loop in the public, we have to look back over a century to Claude Hopkins. Hopkins was a brilliant, albeit manipulative, advertising executive who was hired to market a new product called Pepsodent.
Toothpaste, which back then was not a thing, right?
Correct. In the early 1900s, hardly anyone brushed their teeth regularly. It wasn't a daily habit, and as a result, dental health was atrocious. Hopkins needed to create a national habit out of thin air. He knew he needed a clearly defined cue and a powerful reward.
So what was the cue he chose?
He found the cue in tooth film, that slightly fuzzy, slimy feeling you get on your teeth if you haven't brushed in a while. Hopkins plastered advertisements everywhere saying, "Just run your tongue across your teeth, you'll feel a film." It was a universal trigger that everyone could instantly recognize.
Okay, so he gave him the cue. The routine is brushing with Pepsodent. But what was the reward? Because just having cleaner teeth isn't a strong enough neurological reward to build a daily habit. It's too abstract.
That is where Hopkins' genius lay. The inventors of Pepsodent had added citric acid, mint oil, and several other chemicals to the toothpaste simply to make it taste fresh and extend its shelf life. But these specific chemicals had a side effect. They created a mild, cool, tingling sensation on the gums and tongue.
A tingle?
Yes. Hopkins marketed that tingling sensation as the physical proof that the toothpaste was working. He marketed it as the feeling of a clean mouth.
Even though, chemically speaking, the tingle literally does absolutely nothing to clean your teeth. It's just a mild chemical irritant. It doesn't remove plaque.
Exactly. It is functionally useless. But neurological magic happened. People started to crave that cool tingle. If they forgot to brush their teeth in the morning, their mouths felt wrong all day because they missed the tingle. Hopkins didn't just sell toothpaste, he manufactured a neurological craving that created a century-long national habit. Today, almost every toothpaste on the market adds chemicals specifically to create that tingle.
That is wild. He invented a craving. But what happens when a company misidentifies what the consumer is craving? Because it doesn't always work perfectly. Look at the launch of Febreze by Procter & Gamble in the 1990s.
Febreze is a fascinating counterexample. When P&G chemists invented Febreze, it was an incredible scientific breakthrough. It wasn't just a perfume that masked smells, it contained a chemical that literally trapped and destroyed bad odors at a molecular level. You could spray it on a smoke-filled couch and the smell would vanish. P&G heavily marketed it as the ultimate odor remover. They mapped out what they thought was a flawless habit loop. They identified the cue, a bad smell, like a smelly jacket, a teenager's sneakers, or a pet bed. The routine was spraying the Febreze. The reward was an odorless room.
And it was a massive, expensive flop. Nobody bought it. Why?
Because the marketers misunderstood the cue. People who live in smelly houses become habituated to the smell. It's called nose blindness. If you own 9 cats, you don't smell the cats anymore. So the cue, the bad smell, was entirely invisible to the target audience. They never triggered the loop.
So P&G executives were completely baffled. They had this miracle chemical, and no one wanted it. How did they fix it?
They sent researchers into people's homes to observe how they cleaned. They spent hours watching people make beds, vacuum, and wipe counters. And they realized something profound about the psychology of cleaning. Consumers didn't crave a lack of smell. A lack of something is a terrible reward. What they craved was a tangible reward for their hard work. Cleaning is a chore. When you finish making a room look beautiful, you want a sensory payoff that says, "I did a good job, I am done."
So P&G went back to the lab and added perfume to Febreze, which is ironic considering the whole point of the product was to remove smells.
It's deeply ironic. But they shifted the entire habit loop to align with human psychology. The cue wasn't a bad smell anymore. The cue became a freshly cleaned room. The routine was spraying Febreze over the freshly made bed as a finishing touch. And the reward was that celebratory, fresh, floral scent that signaled the chore was complete.
They hijacked the cleaning habit. And boom, within a year, customers spent $230 million on it. became a blockbuster because they finally understood the emotional reward the basal ganglia was actually craving.
Which brings us to the modern era of marketing. Hopkins and P&G were relying on psychological observation. But today, the data collection on our personal habits is exponentially more sophisticated. And this introduces a highly controversial element, the creep factor.
Okay, this is the story from the notes that always blows my mind. The Target pregnancy prediction algorithm. It sounds like science fiction.
Yeah.
Walk me through how Target can possibly know what's happening inside a customer's body.
It starts with a simple retail reality. For a massive retailer like Target, expecting parents are the holy grail of consumers. Under normal circumstances, our shopping habits are deeply entrenched. We buy our coffee at the same place, we buy our cleaning supplies at the same store. But when a major life event happens, like a pregnancy, those ingrained habits are violently thrown into flux.
Right, because you're overwhelmed, you're exhausted, your priorities completely shift.
Exactly. Brand loyalties are suddenly up for grabs. If Target can hook an expecting mother and get her to buy diapers there, they can also get her to buy her groceries, her clothes, and her electronics there. They have her for years. But the problem is, by the time a birth is public record, every retailer in the world is sending that family coupons. Target needed to reach them earlier. They wanted to know a woman was pregnant before she told anyone.
So they brought in a statistician named Andrew Pohl.
Yes. Andrew Pohl was tasked with creating a pregnancy prediction model. He started by analyzing the purchasing data of thousands of women who had voluntarily registered for baby showers at Target. He fed all their historical purchasing data into a massive computer model looking for hidden patterns, and he found them. He tracked about 25 specific products that, when analyzed together, acted as predictive cues.
What kind of products? Like, obviously pregnancy tests, right?
No, it was much more subtle than that. For instance, he noticed that women in their second trimester began buying unusually large quantities of unscented lotion. In the first 20 weeks, they bought specific vitamin supplements. Later, they bought massive bags of cotton balls or washcloths. Individually, buying cotton balls means nothing. But when the algorithm combined these 25 purchases, cross-referenced with the timing, Pohl was able to assign almost every female shopper a pregnancy prediction score. He could even estimate their due date within a small window.
That is terrifyingly precise. So Target's marketing department gets this algorithm, and they start sending tailored catalogs full of baby coupons to these women. And there is this infamous, incredibly tense story of an angry father storming into a Target store in Minnesota.
Yes. A man walks into a Target demanding to see the manager, clutching a coupon mailer. He is absolutely furious. He slams the mailer on the counter and says, "My daughter got this in the mail. She's still in high school, and you're sending her coupons for baby clothes and cribs. Are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant?"
The manager, who obviously has no idea how the algorithm works, is incredibly apologetic. He grovels, apologizes for the mix-up.
And a few days later, the manager decides to call the father back to apologize one more time. But when the father answers the phone, his tone is completely different. He stops the manager and says, "I had a talk with my daughter. It turns out there have been some activities in my house I wasn't completely aware of. She's due in August. I owe you an apology."
Target's algorithm knew that a teenage girl was pregnant before her own father did, just based on her habit of buying unscented lotion and vitamins. That is astonishing. But it also raises a massive psychological problem for the company. Because when customers eventually figured out that Target was tracking them that closely, there was a massive backlash. People felt spied on. They felt violated. It triggered what you call the creep factor.
Exactly. If Target sent a glossy mailer filled exclusively with baby coupons to a woman who hadn't told anyone she was pregnant, it was terrifying. The sheer accuracy of the algorithm made the customer reject the coupons entirely out of discomfort. So Target had a multi-million-dollar algorithm that they suddenly couldn't use. How did they solve it? They used a psychological principle we see everywhere in habit formation. They decided to dress the new in old clothes.
Camouflage the data.
Yes. They stopped sending mailers that were obviously tailored. Instead, they sandwiched the pregnancy coupons between random, familiar, completely unrelated items. They would put a coupon for a crib right next to a coupon for a lawnmower. They put a coupon for diapers next to one for wine glasses. They made the highly targeted, data-driven offers look like a completely random assortment of general discounts.
Because the human brain accepts the familiar context. The basal ganglia sees the lawnmower, recognizes it as a standard flyer, powers down the suspicion, and then the subconscious accepts the diaper coupon without feeling spied on. That is brilliant, but it's also deeply insidious. It's using our own neurological shortcuts against us.
It is the ultimate weaponization of the habit loop.
And speaking of insidious routines, I want to talk about what happens when habits go wrong inside an organization. We talked about Alcoa, where Paul O'Neill deliberately designed a keystone habit that created a brilliant, transparent culture. But the notes provide a very dark contrast to that. Rhode Island Hospital. What happens when an organization's habits aren't designed by a visionary leader, but instead just evolve accidentally?
When routines evolve accidentally, they usually do so as a survival mechanism. In the academic literature, this is referred to as organizational routines as truces. In any complex workplace, there are different factions fighting for power and resources. Habits and routines often act as an unwritten truce to keep the peace between those warring factions, even if the truce is deeply toxic.
At Rhode Island Hospital, the warring factions were the doctors and the nurses.
Yes. Historically, Rhode Island Hospital had a culture where some of the top surgeons were incredibly arrogant, demanding, and openly hostile. If a nurse questioned a doctor's order, even if the doctor had prescribed a clearly lethal dose of medication or marked the wrong limb for surgery, the doctor would explode. They would publicly humiliate the nurse, or worse, try to get them fired. The power dynamic was entirely unbalanced.
So the nurses, just trying to survive their shifts and protect their patients, created a network of secret habits, hidden routines.
Exactly. They created an underground culture of quiet correction to avoid challenging the doctor's authority directly. They used color-coded whiteboards in the break rooms to secretly warn each other about which doctors were dangerous or prone to mistakes. They developed a habit of writing notes on a patient's chart in a very specific, passive-aggressive way to subtly force a doctor to double-check their own work without the nurse ever having to speak the words aloud.
It was a one-sided truce. The nurses habituated a culture of absolute silence to avoid abuse. But the result of that toxic truce was catastrophic, right?
It led to some of the most horrific medical errors in modern history. Because the habit of silence became so deeply ingrained in the nurses' basal ganglia, they couldn't break it, even in a life or death crisis. There was a tragic incident where an arrogant surgeon was operating on the wrong side of an elderly man's brain. The nurse in the operating room realized the mistake, but she was so deeply entrenched in the habit of not speaking up, the unwritten truce of the hospital, that she offered only a mild, easily ignored suggestion and then stood silently by while the surgeon made a fatal error.
The accidental habit completely overrode her professional duty.
Yes. Accidental habits born out of toxic power dynamics and fear will eventually fail under pressure. The takeaway for leadership is that you cannot let habits form passively. Leaders must use crises to deliberately redesign routines, balancing power and ensuring that the organizational habits empower all members to speak up.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground here. We've seen how powerful forces, from our own microscopic basal ganglia to billion-dollar retail algorithms, to toxic workplace truces can entirely dictate our behaviors. I am honestly feeling a little defensive right now. If all these invisible forces are pulling my strings, how do I defend myself? How do I take back the steering wheel?
The only reliable defense against external manipulation and internal sabotage is deliberate, rigorous internal awareness. Which brings us to the habit reconstruction blueprint. We need to consciously unpack and reconstruct our habits. The research provides a clear, highly actionable 4-step framework.
Okay, let's build the blueprint. Step 1, identify the routine. This feels like the easiest part. You have to define exactly what behavior you are trying to change. But the key here is extreme specificity. It's not a vague goal like, I want to eat better. That's too broad. It has to be the actual chunked action. I want to stop eating a giant chocolate chip cookie at 3:30 p.m. in the cafeteria every day. Or, taking an example from the notes, there was Mandy, a chronic nail biter. Her routine wasn't just being anxious. Her routine was the highly specific physical tic of bringing her fingers to her mouth and chewing on the cuticles until they bled. You have to isolate the exact physical, mental, or emotional action.
Once you have isolated the routine, you move to step 2. Experiment with rewards. This is where you have to become a dispassionate scientist in your own life, because the reward you think you want is rarely the reward your brain is actually craving. When the urge for that 3:30 p.m. cookie hits, don't just use willpower to fight it. Test it. Give yourself a different reward and observe the data.
This is the 15-minute test.
Exactly. On Monday, when the cookie urge hits, don't go to the cafeteria. Go for a brisk walk around the block instead. On Tuesday, go to the cafeteria but buy an apple instead of a cookie. On Wednesday, just walk over to a friend's desk and chat for 10 minutes. Immediately after you finish the alternate activity, sit down and write down 3 words. Any 3 words that pop into your head describing your current emotional or physical state. Relaxed, tired, hungry, Happy, distracted, full. Then force yourself to wait exactly 15 minutes.
And what does that 15 minutes tell us?
It isolates the true craving. If 15 minutes after eating the apple you still desperately want the cookie, then your craving was never about hunger. If you took a walk around the block and 15 minutes later you are still obsessing over the cookie, you weren't craving physical energy. But if you talk to your friend for 10 minutes and 15 minutes later the urge for the cookie has completely vanished. Congratulations. You have successfully isolated the true reward. Your brain wasn't craving sugar, it was craving socialization and a temporary distraction from work.
That is such a powerful tool. Once you know what you're actually hunting for, you can move to step 3. Isolate the cue. This sounds tricky because our lives are incredibly noisy. There is way too much sensory data bombarding us at any given moment to naturally spot what is triggering our habits.
It is tricky, but behavioral researchers have narrowed it down. Almost all habitual cues fit neatly into one of 5 categories. To be a detective in your own life, whenever the urge for the bad habit hits, you have to write down the answers to 5 specific questions.
The 5 categories. Okay, so I feel the urge for the cookie. I pull out my notebook. Category 1, location. Where am I? Sitting at my desk. Category 2, time. What time is it? 3:30 p.m. exactly. Category 3, emotional state. How am I feeling? Bored, slightly overwhelmed by emails. Category 4, other people. Who is around? No one. I'm alone in my cubicle. Category 5, immediately preceding action. What did I just do? I just finished a massive spreadsheet and hit send.
Exactly. If you diligently record those 5 data points for a few days, a pattern will inevitably leap off the page. You might realize the cue isn't hunger, it's the specific time of 3:30 p.m. Or you might realize you only crave a cigarette when you are around one specific, highly stressful coworker. Once you isolate the exact cue and you know the true reward from step 2, you are finally ready for the final step.
Step 4, have a plan. The psychological term for this is implementation intentions. But really, it's just writing a formula. It's literally a Mad Libs for your brain. You write down, when I see CUE, I will do new routine because it provides reward.
So, applying your data. When I notice it is 3:30 p.m. and I feel bored, I will walk to a friend's desk and chat for 10 minutes because it provides the temporary socialization and distraction I am truly craving.
It's like being a detective at a crime scene, except you're both the victim and the culprit. You have to do a root cause audit on your own behavior. And if you fail, if the new routine doesn't stick, you use the 5 whys. Why did my morning workout habit fail today? Because I hit the snooze button. Why did I hit snooze? Because I was exhausted. Why was I exhausted? Because I stayed up until 1 a.m. watching TV. Boom, you just realized your morning habit problem is actually a nighttime habit problem.
It requires meticulous, sometimes uncomfortable self-observation. But once you have that data, you take back control. You are rewriting the basal ganglia's code.
All right, this is a massive amount of information to process, and I know our Cortex Lab listeners always come with questions. We've been tracking the listener notes, and a lot of people have sent in questions trying to apply these theories to their own lives. Let's weave some of these in because they clarify a lot of the finer points we've been discussing.
I'd love to. What's the first one?
Several listeners asked variations of this. Can I ever completely delete a bad habit? If I stop smoking for 20 years, is the habit gone? I know we touched on extinguishing earlier, but let's be absolutely definitive for the audience.
The answer from the neurological community is an explicit, resounding no. Habits are permanently encoded into the physical neural pathways of your brain. You cannot delete them any more than you can delete the ability to ride a bicycle. However, you can ignore, suppress, or replace them by creating a new neurological routine that overpowers the old one. This is why addicts can relapse after decades of sobriety if they are hit with the right cue and extreme stress. You must rely on the golden rule. Keep the cue, keep the reward, consciously swap the routine, and practice the new routine until it becomes the dominant pathway.
Here's another one that came up a lot. What makes a habit feel so hard to resist in the moment? Why does it feel less like a choice and more like I am physically possessed by the urge?
That feeling of possession is the neurological craving we discussed with Julio the monkey. Over time, your brain begins to anticipate the reward. The split second, it registers the cue. It releases dopamine prematurely. If you try to deny that loop, if you see the cue but refuse to perform the routine, that expected reward doesn't arrive. Your brain experiences intense biochemical frustration. It registers as a physical deficit. You aren't just fighting a logical choice, you are fighting a biochemical spike of anticipation and the subsequent painful drop in dopamine. It feels overwhelming because it is a physical reaction in your brain chemistry.
That explains so much of the internal struggle. Okay, here's a question about willpower. Is willpower something I am born with, like eye color, or can I build it?
It is absolutely something you can build. As we discussed with Starbucks, willpower is a muscle. It gets tired as it works harder throughout the day, which is precisely why late-night snacking or impulsive online shopping happens so frequently in the evening your prefrontal cortex is exhausted. But, exactly like a physical bicep, the willpower muscle can be strengthened through consistent, targeted practice.
And the research shows a spillover effect, right?
Yes, and this is fascinating. Strengthening your willpower in one specific area, like forcing yourself to meticulously track your finances every single day, or forcing yourself to sit up straight, will actually spill over and improve your self-discipline in completely unrelated areas. People who start tracking their finances often find they suddenly have the willpower to stick to a diet, or they have more patience with their children. The core muscle gets stronger, and you can apply that strength anywhere.
All right, one more from the listeners before I ask my own. Why is it easier to change a habit if I join a group? Can't I just foster belief on my own?
We mention AA, but the sociology of group dynamics goes much deeper. Groups create belief through social pressure and shared identity. The sociological sources discuss the concept of strong versus weak ties in massive social movements. Think of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks wasn't the first person arrested for refusing to give up her seat, but the boycott exploded around her specifically because she had incredibly dense social networks. She had strong ties, close personal friendships with influential people in the community, but she also had a vast network of weak ties. She was involved in dozens of community clubs, church groups, and volunteer organizations.
So it was the combination of loyalty and peer pressure.
Precisely. The strong ties provided the initial loyalty and support, but the weak ties provided the massive social peer pressure that made the boycott a community-wide habit. In a more modern context, look at Saddleback Church, founded by Rick Warren. They use something called a maturity covenant card. They don't just ask parishioners to believe, they ask them to commit to a small group and track 3 specific habits: having quiet time, tithing a percentage of income, and attending small group meetings. The community acts as an incubator for belief. When you are alone, doubt creeps in. When you're in a group, you suspend disbelief. You look around and your brain says, if this new habit works for them, it can work for me. Groups make new identities stick.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Now, a final question from me, speaking on behalf of everyone who loves a relaxing weekend. Does knowing all of this, knowing that my basal ganglia is this relentless machine constantly chunking routines and carving water channels, does it mean I can never just enjoy a lazy Sunday on the couch? Do I have to be terrified that taking one day off is going to permanently hardwire a lazy habit into my brain?
I am happy to report that you do not need to panic. Not at all. A habit only forms when there's a consistent cue, a repeated routine, and a cultivated craving for a reward. A single lazy Sunday, or even a week of vacation, lacks the intensive, repetitive conditioning required to forge a deep neurological pathway. You still possess conscious choice. The architecture of habit formation isn't meant to make you paranoid about every single action. It is meant to give you agency. You can consciously choose to relax. You can actively decide to be lazy for a day without letting it become an automatic, unthinking routine. The danger only arises when the laziness becomes an unexamined reaction to a daily cue.
Okay, that is a huge relief, because sometimes doing absolutely nothing on the couch is the ultimate reward. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone listening with a final, provocative thought to mull over. Something that bridges the gap between the hard science we've discussed and the philosophy of how we live our lives.
And that thought revolves around the neurology of free will. In the research we synthesized today, there is a fascinating, disturbing contrast between 2 extreme legal and neurological cases. First, there is the case of Brian Thomas, a man in Britain who suffered from severe, medically documented sleep terrors. One night, while camping with his wife, his brain entered an automatic, primitive, defensive habit loop while he was completely asleep. In a state of unconscious terror, he tragically strangled his wife, genuinely believing he was fighting off an intruder.
A horrific tragedy. But when he went to trial, the neurology was presented to the jury.
Yes. The medical experts proved that his basal ganglia had taken over entirely. He acted completely out of an automatic habit loop with zero conscious control or awareness from his prefrontal cortex. Based on that neurological evidence, he was acquitted. He was found not guilty of murder.
Because he literally had no choice. His brain was on autopilot. He was, in that moment, a passenger.
Now contrast Brian Thomas with the case of Angie Bachman. Angie developed a severe, life-ruining gambling habit. Casino companies actively and aggressively targeted her cues. They tracked her data, they sent her free flights, VIP offers, relentless mailers. But more insidiously, the slot machines she played were neurologically designed by engineers to deliver near misses. To a gambling addict's basal ganglia, seeing a near miss on a slot machine triggers the exact same dopamine reward spike as an actual win. The machine was weaponized to hijack her habit loops.
It fed the craving continuously.
Yes, she racked up massive, insurmountable debts and was eventually sued by the casino. In court, her lawyers argued the exact same fundamental defense as Brian Thomas. Her habits took over. The casino weaponized her neurology. She had no biochemical control over her actions.
But the outcome was entirely different. She was held liable, she lost the case, and her debt was upheld.
Exactly. And this is the philosophical crux of the entire deep dive. If the basic neurology of a habit loop is identical in both cases, an automatic loop overriding conscious choice, where does personal responsibility begin?
That is the question for you to ponder. If our brains are just running these chunked loops, carving these trenches, are we ultimately responsible for the outcome? The takeaway from the science is profound. Brian Thomas didn't know his sleep terror habit existed until it was too late. He was unconscious, he could not intervene. Angie Bachman, however, knew she had a gambling habit. She was consciously aware of the destructive loop, even if it felt impossible to break.
And that awareness is the dividing line. Once you know a habit exists, you have the freedom and therefore the profound responsibility to remake it. You are no longer an ignorant passenger. You know the water channel is there. You know the queue is raining down. And most importantly, you now have the blueprint for how to dig a new trench.
And that realization changes everything. Once you see the habit loop in your own life, you can never unsee it. You have the tools to redesign the architecture of your days. Thanks for joining us on this Cortex Lab Deep Dive. We hope this extended journey has been a massive shortcut to understanding your own behavioral programming. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and please check out the affiliate link in the show notes for more tools and resources to master your own habits. Keep learning, keep questioning your routines, and we will see you next time.